The story of Marcus, a Thracian slave trapped in ancient Rome's relentless grip, begins within the gloomy confines of a stone cell beneath the amphitheater. It's 73 BC, and the air is thick with anticipation of the battles above. Marcus reflects on his past, dragged from Thrace by Roman legions, and now destined for the arena with a sword he barely knows how to wield. Spartacus, a fellow slave, begins to whisper in the dark of the cell. He speaks not only of rebellion, but of the intrinsic dignity that the laws of Rome, ironically, acknowledge. Even slaves have souls that cannot be owned, Spartacus says, referring to the forgotten tenets buried within the imperial legal code. This whisper of hope reverberates within Marcus, who, like his fellow slaves, is bound not only by iron, but by the unwritten codes of empire. As night falls, Spartacus' words linger in the minds of the enslaved, offering a glimmer of resistance against a backdrop of brutality. The illusions of captivity are challenged, prompting questions about the boundaries of power. The chronicling of Rome's exploitation cannot be complete without acknowledging the laws that paradoxically protected slave property. Roman masters feared waste over cruelty. Killing a slave without cause violated economic sense, protected by property laws, not compassion. Even the mighty Rome hesitated before the law, a system designed to maintain the delicate balance between fear and productivity. Religion, while functioning as a public duty, provided an ironic sanctuary for slaves. The allowance for private religious practices softened the psychological edges of captivity. Roman law understood slaves needed spiritual anchors to prevent breakdowns that hindered their usefulness. Hence, slaves publicly honored Roman gods while secretly keeping their native faith alive in their quarters. Marcus knew that, like many slaves in Rome, his survival depended on these delicate laws, safeguards against arbitrary death, and the right to private belief. The unyielding chains that bound him were softened by these constraints, offering him a twisted version of hope. Engaged listeners uncover these stories of resilience and survival, offered not as moral judgments, but as a tapestry of humanity's complexity. Rome's limits reveal the eerie loyalty to societal order and the covert resistance implicit in survival. Marcus listens as the words of Spartacus unfurl in the mind, offering not easy liberation, but a recognition of dignity, even in bondage. If you feel drawn into these ancient narratives, share your thoughts, share the journey, and perhaps draw lessons etched in stone and soul across history's canvas. In Roman times, slavery was governed by several intricate limits designed to manage social and economic risks. The third limit dictated that masters were cautioned against selling slaves in ways that recklessly broke their social bonds. Roman law acknowledged that slaves formed emotional ties, such as those with spouses, children, and companions, and breaking these bonds without care could spark psychological collapse or violent retaliation. This measure wasn't born out of sentiment, but rather risk management. A slave whose family was sold off to distant lands had little left to lose, making them prone to actions like suicide, sabotage, or murder. Thus, guidelines were established for sales to balance profit with stability. A skilled craftsman, for example, might be sold along with his apprentice son to preserve the continuity of training and emotional health. Though limited and frequently ignored, these protections existed nonetheless. Slave dealers known for routinely splitting families earned reputations for selling unstable goods. Masters who severed long-standing bonds found their remaining slaves unreliable, as they feared their own relationships would be abruptly cut next. Enforcement of these guidelines varied according to local customs and economic pressures. In times of crisis, families were torn apart without hesitation, and during campaigns, bonds were sacrificed for convenience. Prudent masters understood that maintaining some relationships was advantageous for business, effectively creating a distorted form of family law for the enslaved. The fourth limit governed acts like torture and mutilation. Masters could subject slaves to torture for extracting information, punishment, or to identify runaways, but such acts had to serve a purpose and not merely be random sadism. Torture practices were regulated by precedents and customs. Punishment was required to be proportional to the crime and aimed at preserving the slave's productivity. A runaway slave, for instance, might be branded with FUG for fugitive, but any form of mutilation that hampered laborability was forbidden. Enforcement involved social ostracism, economic losses, and rare legal actions. Cruel masters faced shunning, and their damaged slaves represented financial losses. Romans were well aware that random violence could foster retaliation, be it poisoned food, burned homes, or endangered families. Controlled acts of violence disciplined, whereas uncontrolled acts invited chaos. Justinian's Digest, drawing on earlier precedents, codified regulations for torture by requiring specific goals and safeguards. Whipping a slave for stealing bread was legal. Whipping for amusement violated norms, even if it was rarely punished. Intent, proportion, and purpose offered slaves minimal protection, but set precedents to restrain absolute power. The fifth limit concerned slave testimony in court. Given that masters could coerce false statements, testimonies of slaves were considered suspect. To ensure justice, slave testimonies carried less weight than those of free citizens, and they could only testify against their masters in extreme cases like treason or murder. Courts employed techniques like separate interrogations to identify coached testimonies. This measure prevented masters from exploiting slaves to frame adversaries or evade accountability, acknowledging that coerced testimonies were unreliable. Nevertheless, slaves could still be tortured to testify against others, and false testimonies resulted in harsh punishments, exposing them to exploitation despite the law providing limited safeguards. The sixth limit was economically driven. Masters were not permitted to waste slave labor in ways that negatively impacted the broader economy or offended community standards. Though not codified, enforcement was carried out through social and political exclusion. The ninth limit involved sexual boundaries. Masters could rape slaves legally, but not in ways that violated social norms or religious taboos. A master lacking Roman virtue, discretion, and dignity undermined his authority. These constraints offered little protection, but showed power operated within cultural limits. Rarely successful and dangerous, this right was a final check on egregious cruelty. Appeals worked best for valuable slaves or when abuse threatened public order. Unsuccessful appeals brought brutal punishment, but the possibility restrained masters, especially when their actions offended Roman ideals of dignified authority. These 10 limits shaped a complex landscape, restraining the absolute power Romans claimed over slaves. None granted true freedom or dignity. All were regularly violated. Yet, they marked a historic attempt to regulate human ownership. Every limit acknowledged slaves' humanity while denying their freedom, reinforcing their status as property while restricting its use. But they also exposed its fragility. Every protection admitted slaves' capacity for suffering and dignity. In that dark cell, Spartacus and his peers grasped this truth. Power that requires limits admits its own illegitimacy. When they rebelled, breaking free in 73 BC, they wielded this knowledge, targeting the system's weaknesses. Their 2-year revolt shook Rome, ending in 71 BC with 6,000 crucified along the Appian Way. Yet, those crosses revealed a deeper truth. Even absolute power has limits. Even property can resist. Even slaves can choose death over bondage. The system's regulations made it bearable, but also vulnerable, protecting masters as much as slaves. As you step away from this story into a world where slavery's forms have shifted but persist, remember Spartacus' lesson from that shadowed cell. Power that accepts limits reveals its weakness. Authority that requires boundaries admits its injustice. And humans who understand their oppression's constraints have already begun to break free. The arena's dust has settled, the crosses have crumbled, and Rome has faded into history. But the question remains as vital today as it was 2,000 years ago. What couldn't owners do to slaves? The answer reveals not the mercy of the powerful, but the stubborn, unconquerable dignity of those they sought to own.